Welcome to Dark Shadows Stories, where mysterious and profound spiritual tales will guide you into a peaceful space, helping your mind relax and drift into a restful sleep. Let the gentle sounds and deep lessons about life, love, and enlightenment soothe your worries, bringing you a night of tranquility. Lie back, close your eyes, and allow us to lead you on a spiritual journey where you'll find calm and serenity. Wishing you a peaceful night and sweet dreams. 30 years ago, it was a quiet and peaceful town nestled in the rural South. Dirt roads lined with sprawling oak trees stretched toward the horizon, and small wooden houses with tin roofs dotted the landscape. Life here was simple, slow, and unchanging. On the night I was born, the full moon hung low and bright in the sky, illuminating the path to the midwife's house. My father and aunt carried my mother there under its light, without needing the oil lantern they had brought. At exactly 3 a.m., my first cries echoed through the quiet town. Our midwife, Mrs. Rowena, was the town's go-to for childbirth. A woman of immense experience, she carried a quiet wisdom that came from years of delivering babies in this close-knit community. She had seen it all, happy beginnings, tragic losses, and everything in between. My family had experienced its share of heartbreak before I was born. My older sister had died during childbirth, and my mother fainted from shock, waking to the grief of losing her firstborn. My brother, born a year later, lived to be 6 before succumbing to a fever that no doctor could cure. By the time I came into the world, my parents carried a quiet but unshakable fear. They hovered over me, unable to fully embrace the joy of my birth, haunted by the loss of their first 2 children. From the very beginning, my life seemed marked by peculiarities. Born under the full moon, during what locals called the witching hour, my arrival was surrounded by whispers of superstition. In our small southern town, beliefs in omens and spirits lingered, passed down through generations. My grandmother, the matriarch of our family, was particularly uneasy. Though she adored me, she couldn't ignore the strange occurrences that followed my birth. My frailty worried her most. I was weak and cried endlessly through the nights. When I was 6 months old, my parents pooled their savings and took me to the nearest county doctor, hoping for answers. After a thorough examination, the doctor found nothing physically wrong with me and simply prescribed vitamins. Though relieved on the surface, my mother remained restless. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something unexplainable, surrounding me. As time passed, my grandmother took charge of caring for me while my parents worked long hours. She observed things others dismissed, like the way my gaze seemed to fixate on empty corners of the room, as if I were watching someone unseen. As my first birthday approached, my grandmother became more convinced that something wasn't right. She watched my parents grow weary from sleepless nights as I cried endlessly, my frail body seeming to struggle against the world. On the day of my first birthday, my parents held a small ceremony at home, following local traditions. They placed a selection of objects in front of me: a book, a coin, a small toy truck, and a wooden comb, each symbolizing a different path in life. The idea was to see which object I would pick, a fun little ritual that everyone in town loved. Instead of reaching for anything on the table, I crawled past it and pointed toward the family altar in the corner of the room. The adults froze, puzzled by my behavior. "What's he doing?" my father murmured, his brows furrowing. I babbled something incomprehensible, then stretched my hand toward a candle flickering on the altar. "Light," I said, my first word. The room went silent as I reached for the candle. My mother hesitated, then plucked it from the altar and handed it to me. I held it tightly in my small hands, smiling as if nothing else in the world mattered. Then, without a sound, I curled up on the floor and fell asleep, the candle still clutched in my arms. From that night on, strange things began happening. At first it was subtle, a flickering light or the sound of faint footsteps in the hallway. But soon the whispers started. My grandmother was the first to notice. Late at night, she would wake up to the faint sound of a child's laughter or someone murmuring softly, though no one else in the house was awake. The neighbors, already wary of our family, began to talk more. Some whispered that our house was cursed. Others said I was a child of the spirits. My father, ever the skeptic, dismissed these rumors, but my mother and grandmother grew increasingly uneasy. One evening, after hearing me cry out in my sleep, my grandmother made a decision. She called my parents into the kitchen and said, "Something is wrong. The child needs help, not from a doctor, but from someone who understands these things." My grandmother's words, though spoken softly, carried weight. She insisted that whatever was happening could not be explained by medicine alone. At first, my father resisted. Practical to a fault, he refused to believe in the supernatural. "This is nonsense," he said. "Our son doesn't need a shaman. He's fine." But my mother, tired and worried, sided with my grandmother. "Let's just try," she pleaded. "If it doesn't work, at least we'll know we've done everything we can." Reluctantly, my father agreed. Guided by a neighbor's recommendation, my parents set out to find Mr. Hayes, a retired healer who lived several miles away in an old house surrounded by dense woods. My parents arrived at Mr. Hayes' house late in the afternoon, following a dirt trail that twisted through overgrown trees. The house, weathered and sagging, looked as though it hadn't been cared for in years. The door was locked, and there was no sign of life. Peering through a cracked window, they saw an altar inside, candles still burning faintly. A neighbor nearby told them the grim truth. Mr. Hayes had passed away just weeks earlier under mysterious circumstances. The neighbor explained that Mr. Hayes was found sitting upright in a creek, hands clasped as though in prayer. His face was frozen in terror, eyes wide open. Despite his bizarre posture, the authorities ruled his death an accidental drowning. My parents returned home that evening, their hearts heavy. They told my grandmother everything, and she grew pale, her usual composure slipping. That night, she barely slept, her turning and sighing filling the quiet of our small house. The mystery around my presence only deepened. As the weeks passed, the strangeness around me only seemed to grow. The neighbors, already wary, started keeping their children away from me. I often played alone, watched over by my grandmother, who never let me out of her sight. One evening, my grandmother and I sat on the porch watching the fireflies, the faint hum of crickets filling the air. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow move across the field beyond our house. The shadow I saw that evening lingered in my mind, but I was too young to understand its significance. As days turned into weeks, the distance between me and the other children grew. The whispers in the town became louder, but within our home, silence reigned. My grandmother remained vigilant, her gaze often lingering on me with a mix of love and concern. Life settled into an uneasy rhythm, but the feeling that something unseen loomed over us never truly left. One evening, just after dusk, we were settling in for the night when we heard a frantic voice echoing through the quiet streets. "Johnny, Johnny, where are you?" It was Aunt Grace calling for her son. At first, no one paid much attention. Johnny had a reputation for wandering off, but after half an hour, her cries became more desperate. My father and a few neighbors grabbed flashlights and set out to help her search. They scoured the area, but Johnny was nowhere to be found. The search led everyone toward the outskirts of the town, near an old abandoned field where children often played during the day. As they approached, the flashlights revealed 4 makeshift huts built from tall grass, but there was no sign of Johnny. Then someone shouted, "There he is!" All the lights turned toward a small figure standing by a twisted oak tree near the edge of the field. It was Johnny, but he wasn't moving. His back was to the group, and his head hung low as if staring at the ground. As Aunt Grace rushed toward him, Johnny suddenly collapsed, crumpling to the ground like a rag doll. She scooped him up in her arms, her cries breaking the eerie silence. Johnny's face was pale, his breathing shallow, and he wouldn't respond to her frantic questions. The group quickly carried him back to the house, but I couldn't take my eyes off the twisted oak tree. As my mom carried me home, I glanced back and thought I saw something, or someone, standing in the shadows beneath the tree. As we returned home, the air felt heavier, and the usual evening calm was replaced by an unsettling quiet. I couldn't shake the image of the twisted oak tree, nor the figure I thought I saw beneath it. That night, my dreams were plagued by shadows and whispers, as though the field itself was trying to speak to me. The next morning, Johnny woke up but remained silent, his eyes distant and unfocused. Aunt Grace sought help from the town's spiritual healer, desperate for answers. Johnny's condition puzzled everyone. Though he woke up the next day, he wouldn't speak or even look at anyone. Aunt Grace, frantic with worry, called for the town's spiritual healer, Mrs. Henderson. Known for her knowledge of both herbal remedies and the supernatural, she arrived later that evening. After examining Johnny and listening to Aunt Grace recount the events, Mrs. Henderson frowned. "Something dark followed that boy," she said gravely. "It's connected to the old oak tree." Mrs. Henderson explained that whatever had taken hold of Johnny was tied to the oak tree, a place she believed to be marked by something malevolent. She advised Aunt Grace to conduct a cleansing ritual near the tree to sever its connection to Johnny. On the night of the ritual, my family and several neighbors gathered near the field. Mrs. Henderson lit candles and burned sage as she chanted prayers. As the ritual progressed, a sudden gust of wind extinguished the flames, and we all froze. As the gust of wind swept through, blowing out the candles, a strange and heavy silence settled over the field. All eyes turned toward the twisted oak tree. There, beneath its gnarled branches, a figure emerged, a shadowy form cloaked in tattered red fabric, barely distinguishable from the darkness surrounding it. Gasps echoed through the group, and Mrs. Henderson's voice trembled as she continued her chants. The figure stood motionless, its face obscured by the shadows, as if watching us with a chilling stillness. As Mrs. Henderson continued her chants, the figure seemed to shift, its form flickering like a flame caught in the wind. Just as the group's fear reached its peak, the figure raised an arm, pointing directly at the mound where Johnny had been found. A low, guttural sound filled the air, sending shivers down my spine. Suddenly, the candles reignited on their own, their flames brighter than before. The figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the eerie silence of the field behind. Following the ritual, Johnny began to recover slowly. Though he never spoke of what happened near the tree, his once lively demeanor became subdued, as though a part of him had been left behind in the field. The oak tree was avoided from that day forward, and no one dared to play near the field again. The whispers about our town's dark secrets grew louder, and I, even as a child, knew this was something that would linger in my memory forever. Thank you for spending your time with Dark Shadow Stories tonight. We hope our tales have brought you peace and comfort as you drift into a restful sleep. May your dreams be sweet and your night filled with serenity. Good night, and we'll see you again soon.